The breech-loaded wonder. How two iron short pipes changed street fighting and why they were feared even in concrete bunkers. Hello, friends. Before you dive into this story, do me a favor. If you're interested in weapons, history, and brilliant engineering solutions, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Your support helps find and tell the most gripping stories. And write in the comments. Did you learn something new? Or maybe your grandfathers encountered this weapon. I really value your opinion. Now get ready. This will be a long, detailed, and at times shocking story about a weapon born out of desperation that became a legend. The bloody stalemate. Spring of 1943, when walls became stronger than tanks. Picture this. Spring of 1943. The catastrophe of Stalingrad for the Wehrmacht had thundered past. The Battle of Kursk was still ahead. But the Red Army had already tasted the offensive. And that taste turned out to be bitter and bloody. We were advancing, but every step forward was paid for with incredible losses. Why? The answer lay on the desks of our artillery designers in the form of captured German reports and intelligence dispatches. The Germans, retreating, had radically changed their defensive tactics. This was no longer a line of trenches in an open field. These were deeply echeloned strongpoints, dug into the ground, built into the stone buildings of European towns and villages, into farms, churches, cemeteries. Each such point, a street intersection turned into a fortress. A stone basement reinforced with concrete and steel beams. Upper floors with machine gun nests. Attics with observers and snipers. All approaches were covered by interlocking fire. And all of it was tied to the terrain so that behind it there was a ravine or a reverse slope of a hill, which our artillery with its flat trajectory simply could not reach. Our 122mm and 152mm howitzers fired at the front wall. Tons of concrete and bricks spilled onto the street, but often this only created an additional barricade, behind which the surviving Germans continued to fire from the depths of the building. To destroy such a nest completely required a direct hit right into the heart, almost vertically from above, to penetrate all the floors and explode in the basement. A howitzer was incapable of this. And then a frightening detail surfaced in the reports. The Germans used their 21-centimeter heavy infantry guns and mortars for just such dirty work. Incredible monsters brought up on tractors. Their heavy, high-explosive shells, falling almost vertically, left nothing of a stone house but a pile of rubble and dust. Intelligence reported, the effect is achieved not simply by a large caliber, but by a high-explosive charge mass of 40 to 45 kilograms, dropped from the sky. This was a sledgehammer, not a scalpel. A clear and vitally important task stood before Soviet engineers. We needed our own super-heavy mortar, caliber about 160 millimeters. The task, to lift 40 kilograms of TNT into the sky and accurately place it into the inner courtyard or right on the roof of an enemy fortification. Seemed what could be simpler. We have experience creating 120mm regimental mortars. We scale it up, reinforce it, and off we go. But here, everyone encountered the first seemingly insurmountable dead end. A dead end dictated by cold and impartial physics. The curse of weight. Why the mortar hit the limit of human capability. Let's think like a 40s engineer. A mortar, a weapon brilliant in its simplicity. A smooth tube, a fine stabilised projectile, musle lo ading. No complex breech, no recoil mechanisms, no carriage. Cheap, angry, can be stamped out by the thousands. But all this simplicity rests on one fundamental principle. The crew must load the weapon by hand. Now imagine a projectile with a caliber of 160 millimeters. This is not just scaling up. Its body, to withstand firing pressure, must have thick steel walls. Such a pig weighs nearly 50 kilograms. Half a hundredweight of iron and explosives. Its size and geometry make it incredibly finicky. The slightest misalignment when lowering it into the barrel and it could simply jam. Or worse, not reach the firing pin, stopping on a dead travel. And now the main thing, how to load this 50-kilogram slug. The barrel of a heavy mortar is a pipe 2 or even 3 meters tall. To lift such a shell to human height and, without tilting it, carefully lower it into the barrel under enemy fire, This would be pure suicide for the crew. The rate of fire would drop to 1 shot every 10 minutes. What kind of suppression of a strong point could we talk about? But that's not all. There was a deadly technical nuance: double loading. In the heat of battle, in the smoke, under the commander's shouts, a tired soldier could mistakenly drop a second shell into an already loaded barrel. For classic mortars, this 100% meant a barrel burst and the death of the entire crew. It happened with 120mm shells. And what would happen if 100 kilograms of explosives detonated in the barrel? That wouldn't be just an accident. It would be a miniature explosion sweeping away everything within tens of meters. It became clear the classic muzzle-loading mortar scheme for a 160mm caliber had hit a wall. The wall of human strength, dexterity, and endurance. And the wall of mechanical safety. A fundamentally different approach was needed. A breakthrough was needed. Or the idea itself had to be abandoned. Genius by contradiction. Ivan Tverovsky and the birth of the MT-13. The breakthrough was made by a team of designers led by Ivan Grigorievich Tverovsky. Today, only specialists know this name, but his contribution is hard to overestimate. He and his team didn't bash their heads against the wall trying to perfect the imperfectible. They went by contradiction. They asked themselves a heretical question for a mortar designer. What if we abandon the main principle? What if we load not from the muzzle but from the breech? Thus, in 1944, the MT-13, heavy mortar, model of 1943, was born. This was not a mortar, and not a howitzer. It was a unique hybrid later called a breech-loading mortar. Look at this system through the eyes of a soldier. In front of you is not just a pipe on a baseplate. This is an intellectual machine. The barrel was divided into 2 parts. A stationary, massive breech was attached to the carriage, and the barrel itself could pivot on trunnions. Here is the key solution. For loading, the barrel was not raised up, but lowered down to a horizontal position. And it did this almost by itself under its own weight, controlled by an ingenious 3-position balancer. Imagine the process. Command: load. The gunner turns a handle. The massive barrel, instead of being pulled upward, smoothly and obediently drops backward, laying itself on a special loading tray. It lies down so softly that the troops joked about it. The gun itself offers the barrel to your hands. Now the breech is open. 2 crew members roll a cart with the heavy shell up to the tray and simply roll it into the barrel. No lifting to height. No fear of dropping it. The shell is rammed into a perfectly machined chamber, where ovality tolerances were as little as 0.15 millimeters, the level of core artillery. After this, the barrel returns to the firing angle. And here lies the main brilliance. The breech loading scheme physically eliminated double loading. Until the breech is closed, the barrel will not return to position and firing is impossible. The murderous problem of a large caliber was solved by a single engineering idea. Simplicity permeated the entire design. There were no hydraulic recoil mechanisms. The entire monstrous recoil of hundreds of kilograms of pressure was absorbed by a massive steel baseplate sinking into the ground. Upon firing, the plate deformed and shifted slightly in the soil by 25 to 35 millimeters, acting as a shock absorber. This micro-recoil unexpectedly extended barrel life to an incredible 700 to 900 rounds. The weapon could be towed by a truck without disassembly. And its barrel was a universal tool. They hooked a cable to it to pull out a baseplate stuck in mud. Soldiers hung on it to create additional leverage. This was a weapon created for war, not for parades. The voice of the god of war. The MT-13 goes into battle. The combat baptism of the MT-13 took place at the end of the war in the fiercest battles, during the assault on cities in East Prussia, in the Carpathians during the breakthrough of permanent defenses. They were combined into separate heavy mortar brigades of the Supreme High Command Reserve, the artillery elite, thrown into the most difficult sectors. The effect exceeded all expectations. A 4-pood, 41-kilogram, high-explosive shell was not just a projectile. It was a flying piece of an earthquake. When hitting a stone house, it left no chances. All floors were penetrated, walls collapsed inward, turning the building into a mass grave for the garrison. But the main thing was its trajectory. A howitzer fires on a high angle, but still relatively flat trajectory. To hit an inner courtyard surrounded by tall buildings, you would have to fire almost along the street, risking hitting your own advancing troops. The MT-13, however, could set up several houses behind the front line and launch its shell almost vertically upward. It, describing a high arc, would fall straight down, right into that very courtyard well or onto the roof of a bunker shielded by a reverse slope. There are amazing lines in reports, for example from the 3rd Guards Mortar Brigade. After several hits from 160mm shells, garrisons usually abandoned their positions, even if the fortifications remained intact. Astonishing, right? Even if the bunker withstood the blow, the psychological effect was devastating. Imagine yourself in a concrete box. Above you, you hear the howl of a falling shell. Shells of these calibers are audible separately from others. Then, an impact that shakes the whole earth. Concrete dust falls, the light goes out. 30 seconds later, a second one. Then a third. You understand the next hit could be direct. Only the most fanatical and disciplined infantry could withstand this. By 1944, the German infantry was no longer that. The post-war masterpiece. Boris Shavarin and the evolution of the M-160. The war ended, but the need for such a weapon did not disappear. The New World Order, the Cold War, the doctrine of breaking through NATO fortified areas in Europe, all this required the development of the idea. The baton from Tverovsky was taken up by the Design Bureau under the leadership of Boris Ivanovich Shavarin, the legendary creator of the entire Soviet mortar fleet. Based on the MT-13, the M-160, model of 1949, was created. This was not a revolution, but a brilliant evolution. Shavarin's team took the successful essence and polished it to a shine. The barrel was lengthened by more than 800 millimeters. This increased the muzzle velocity to 240 meters per second, and the firing range jumped from 5 to 8,000 meters. Now the system could be hidden even further. A spring shock absorber was added, which softened the impact when the heavy barrel returned to the loading position. The crew's work became safer and faster. A mechanical rammer was introduced. Now the shell was driven into the chamber not by a soldier's shoulder, but by a special mechanism. This eliminated the risk of damaging the shell's rotating bands and further increased the rate of fire to 3 rounds per minute. The wheeled carriage was unified with the ZIS-151 truck. This was a huge step forward for the troops. Now, to transport the mortar, a unique tractor wasn't needed, any army truck would do. Repair, spare parts, everything became simpler. But the philosophy remained unchanged. Minimum complexity where it threatens reliability, and maximum technological sophistication where it is indispensable. The M-160 became an engineering masterpiece, powerful, long-ranged, yet relatively simple to produce and operate. A unique niche. Why no one else had this weapon but us? Now let's take a step back and look at the big picture on a global scale. A surprising fact: a specialized class of breech-loading 160mm mortars never developed in the world. NATO armies took a different path. They bet on powerful towed and self-propelled howitzers of 155mm caliber and above. Their logic: universality. One system should conduct both high-angle and flat fire different types of shells, including nuclear. But they paid for this universality with complexity, cost, and, importantly, the inability in some urban combat or mountain warfare scenarios to replicate the vertical strike of a mortar. The Soviet and later Russian school preserved this narrow but critically important niche, the large-caliber mortar. Why? Because of doctrine. Our military thought always assumed a large-scale conflict involving the breakthrough of deeply echeloned enemy defenses, the Siegfried Line, later NATO fortified areas. We needed precisely a backyard sledgehammer, a tool for prying open pillboxes. The MT-13 and M-160 became that tool. They remained in service until the very end of the 80s. Not by inertia, not due to conservatism, but because they had no full-fledged replacement in their specific role. They were only retired with the arrival of a new generation of artillery systems, more universal and mobile, but the spirit of this weapon, the spirit of a simple, targeted, and devastating solution to a complex tactical problem, lives on to this day. Lessons from iron and thought. The history of the MT-13 and M-160 is not just the history of two artillery systems. It is a textbook on engineering thinking. It is the story of how, faced with a dead end, you cannot break, but reject an axiom. You can go by contradiction and create something brilliant in its new simplicity. They proved that technological sophistication is not about the number of gears and transistors. True technological sophistication is the unconditional correspondence of a design to its combat task. It is when every gram of metal, every component works exactly as a soldier in a trench in smoke under fire needs it to. These short pipes on wheels remained in the shadow of the famed Katyushas, fearsome IS tanks, and legendary T-34s. But those who faced them head-on in the stone sacks of Königsberg or on the streets of Budapest remembered them forever. Remembered them as the voice of inevitable and absolute destruction, falling from the sky. Friends, we've reached the end of this long, but hopefully gripping story. If it hooked you, if you want me to continue analyzing such unique and forgotten weapons, let me know. Subscribe to the channel, give it a thumbs up. That's the best support for me. And be sure to write in the comments what surprised you the most. Maybe you have your own stories or thoughts on the topic. Let's discuss. Your activity is a signal that such in-depth materials are needed. Until next time in future analyses.